Picture the morning of the first day of World War III. Not the missiles, not the smoke, not the rubble. What you are really looking at, if you know how to read it, is a balance sheet. A balance sheet with nothing left on the right side. The bombs were the symptom. The insolvency was the disease. We have been told for decades that world wars are started by tyrants, by ideology, by the madness of strongmen who crave territory and blood. History teachers frame it as a political story. Generals frame it as a tactical story. And Hollywood frames it as a heroic story with clear villains and clear heroes. Every single one of them is wrong. Every world war in modern history has been, at its core, a bankruptcy proceeding. A collection of nations that could no longer service their debts, could no longer feed their populations through trade, and could no longer hold their social contracts together without violence. War is what happens when the ledger breaks, and the morning after WW3 begins. What is truly missing is not just your neighborhood. It is the entire financial architecture that made your neighborhood possible. Let that land for a second. Before we talk about what that first gray morning looks, smells, and sounds like, we need to go back to the world that built itself into a trap so elegant, so deeply invisible, that almost nobody saw it coming until the morning it snapped shut. For the better part of 80 years after 1945, the global economy existed in what economists called the long peace. It was the most prosperous era in recorded human history. By 2024, global GDP had reached over $110 trillion. More wealth had been created in the past century than in the previous 5,000 years of human civilization combined. Supermarkets in the smallest American towns stocked fruit from Chile, fish from Norway, and electronics from Shenzhen. A middle-class teenager in Ohio could order a product manufactured in Vietnam and have it arrive in 2 days. Think about the scale of that. The world had woven itself together through trade, through digital payment rails, through undersea fiber optic cables, through a network of container ships crossing every ocean, every single hour of every single day. This was the architecture of modern abundance. 7 billion people, fed and connected, dependent on a system so complex and so interdependent that almost none of them understood how it actually worked. At the center of all of it sat the United States dollar, the reserve currency of the world, the language in which oil was priced, in which debt was denominated, in which every major commodity, from wheat to copper, was bought and sold. The dollar was not just a currency. It was the operating system of human civilization, and like all operating systems, it had one fatal vulnerability. It could be hacked. But the real rot was not being hacked from outside. It was growing from inside, quietly, patiently, like a cancer that looks like ordinary fat tissue on every scan until it is far too late. By 2020, global debt had crossed $280 trillion. That is not a typo. 280 trillion. To put that in perspective, if you stacked $1 trillion bills flat, the pile would reach the moon and back over 200 times. By 2023, that number had climbed past $307 trillion, according to the Institute of International Finance. This was the monster living in the basement of the global economy. Every government, every central bank, every major corporation had spent decades borrowing money they could not repay, rolling the debt over, paying interest with new debt, and calling it growth. This is the oldest trap in the ledger of human history. You do not borrow your way into prosperity. You borrow your way into dependence. And dependence, at scale, is just slow-motion insolvency. The antagonist in this story is not a general. It is not a president or a prime minister. The antagonist is compound interest, the cruel, mechanical, emotionless engine that turns every unpaid dollar into 2, then 4, then 8. The antagonist is the bond market, the collective judgment of creditors who, at some point, stop believing the story they have been told and start demanding their money back, all at once. Central banks around the world had spent 15 years printing money to suppress that judgment. The Federal Reserve alone expanded its balance sheet from roughly $900 billion in 2008 to nearly $9 trillion by 2022. The European Central Bank did the same. The Bank of Japan did the same. They called it quantitative easing. What it actually was, stripped of the academic language, was a global slow-motion devaluation of every currency on Earth, a theft committed in plain sight against savers, against wages, against the future. The geopolitical fault lines cracked first, not along borders, but along oil pipelines and shipping routes. By early 2025, the petrodollar system that had governed global energy trade since 1974 was visibly fracturing. Saudi Arabia began accepting Chinese yuan for oil payments. Russia had been cut off from SWIFT, the global banking messaging system, following the 2022 Ukraine conflict. Over 85 nations representing more than 40% of global GDP were conducting bilateral trade deals explicitly designed to bypass the dollar. This was not ideology. This was arithmetic. Nations drowning in dollar-denominated debt had enormous incentive to escape the system that kept them drowning. The dollar was both the disease and the cure, and the world was beginning to refuse the medicine. Meanwhile, the resource wars were already being fought. They just had different names. The conflict over rare earth minerals in sub-Saharan Africa, critical for every battery, every semiconductor, every weapon system. The contest for Arctic shipping lanes as the ice retreated. The quiet, vicious competition over food-producing agricultural land as aquifers in the American Midwest, the Indian subcontinent, and the Middle East ran dry at accelerating speed. By 2024, over 3 billion people lived in areas of high water stress. You do not get to call that a future problem when 3 billion people are already thirsty. The match that lit the fire was not one moment. It was never one moment. It was the accumulated weight of a world that had borrowed against every tomorrow it could imagine, and had finally arrived at the tomorrow with no credit left to borrow against. The specific mechanism of collapse played out across a brutal 18-month spiral. In October of 2025, a sovereign debt crisis in 3 simultaneously over-leveraged emerging market economies triggered a wave of currency devaluations across Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe. Currencies in Turkey, Pakistan, and Argentina had already collapsed individually. But this time the contagion was different. The interconnectedness that had made globalization so profitable made it catastrophically fragile when the direction of capital reversed. The yield on 10-year U.S. Treasury bonds hit 7.4% in November 2025 as foreign central banks began liquidating their dollar reserves to defend their own collapsing currencies. The U.S. government was paying $1.7 trillion per year in interest on its $36 trillion national debt, Think about that number alone. Not defense, not healthcare, not roads, just the interest. $1.7 trillion every single year just to stand still. The gold was flowing. The credit was tightening. The allies were doing the math. Global equity markets fell 38% in 6 weeks. Not a correction, a liquidation. The kind of selling that happens when institutions stop trying to find value and start trying to find exits. By January 2026, 3 of the 8 largest systemically important global banks had been placed under emergency government receivership. Their balance sheets, when finally exposed, showed derivative exposure ratios that made Lehman Brothers in 2008 look like a minor accounting error. Food commodity prices had already doubled in 12 months before the first missile was ever launched. Wheat hit $24 per bushel, 3 times its historical average. Palm oil, the lubricant of processed food across Asia and Africa, hit scarcity levels not seen since the 1970s stagflation crisis. Fertilizer prices, already elevated since the Russia-Ukraine disruption of 2022, were now 340% above their 2020 levels. You cannot separate hunger from instability. History never allows that separation. A hungry population does not debate policy. It acts. The smoking gun was a document nobody outside of 4 rooms in 3 capitals was supposed to ever read. In March 2026, during a classified session of the G7 finance ministers, a 12-page memo circulated under the title Continuity of Reserve Currency Framework under Cascading Sovereign Default Scenario. It was, in plain language, a foreclosure notice on the global financial system. The memo outlined what its authors had spent 2 decades denying publicly. The dollar-based reserve system could not survive simultaneous sovereign defaults by more than 4 major economies. The contagion mathematics were irreversible past that threshold. The document noted, with bureaucratic coldness, that military escalation in contested resource zones was now economically preferable to uncontrolled systemic financial dissolution. Read that sentence again. Military escalation was considered economically preferable. The generals did not start this war. The accountants did. One finance ministry official, who later leaked fragments of the session, described the mood in the room as clinical. They were not panicking. They were liquidating. They were making the same calculation a bank receiver makes when standing in the ruins of an insolvent institution. Decide what to save. Write off the rest. Minimize the cascading losses to the creditors who still matter. The nations deemed too expensive to stabilize were, in the language of that memo, non-recoverable positions. Non-recoverable positions. The bureaucratic term for human societies that had been written off. The first strikes came in April 2026. Energy infrastructure, semiconductor fabrication hubs, undersea communications cables, port facilities on 3 continents. Not random destruction. Surgical liquidation of the assets that gave rival economic blocs their leverage. This was not a world war fought over territory in the old sense. It was a war fought over who controlled the remaining productive capacity of a global economy that was already in insolvency proceedings. The morning of the first day arrives. And now you understand why what is missing is not what you expected to miss. You step outside and the gray sky carries ash. But the silence that destroys you is not just the absence of birdsong. It is the absence of price signals. The absence of the quiet and visible hum of 1 billion daily transactions that decided how every resource in your civilization was allocated. That hum is gone. Your bank account exists as a number on a server somewhere, but the server's communications are severed. The fiber cables that carried the authentication signal from your bank to the payment processor to the merchant's terminal were cut 12 hours ago in the opening strike. You have $4,300 in your account. That number still exists. It simply cannot be accessed, verified, or used. Sovereignty is solvency, and right now you are insolvent. The ATM on the corner has been dry since yesterday afternoon, not because the bank ran out of money in the vault sense, because the armored car delivery networks run on GPS routing systems that are now being actively jammed across a 400-mile radius. The supply chain that restocked that ATM every 72 hours is a complex, fragile, digital system. And complex, fragile, digital systems are the first casualties of a war designed by economists and executed by technicians. Your credit card is laminated plastic. It is worth exactly as much as the network it no longer connects to, which is nothing. Cash, physical paper cash, has become the only financial instrument that functions, and the velocity of its disappearance from circulation is breathtaking. In the first 6 hours after communications fail, hoarding strips the physical cash supply from most neighborhoods faster than any bank run in recorded history. People who scorned carrying physical currency for a decade are turning pockets inside out, looking for 20s. This is what the history books will call the cash famine, and it hits before the food famine begins. The supply chains collapse in sequence, each one's failure triggering the next in a brutal cascade. Just-in-time manufacturing and distribution, the model that made modern retail so efficient and so cheap, has essentially zero buffer against a disruption of this scale. Most supermarkets carry 3 days of inventory under normal conditions. Most hospitals carry roughly 4 to 7 days of critical medication supply. Most gas stations carry 6 to 12 hours of fuel at peak demand. These were optimized systems, optimized for profit in a stable world, catastrophically brittle in an unstable one. By midday of the first morning, the fuel situation becomes the master variable that controls everything else. Without fuel, trucks do not move. Without trucks, food does not move. Without food moving, the social contract between government and citizen enters its terminal stage. The crude oil market, already in chaos from the infrastructure strikes, has no functioning price discovery mechanism. The exchanges are offline. The brokers are unreachable. Oil is simply unavailable at any price in the affected zones, because price requires communication, and communication is what was severed first. In 1973, when OPEC cut oil supplies by just 5%, gas lines stretched for miles, and the U.S. economy fell into its worst recession in 30 years. Now imagine not a 5% reduction. Imagine a 70% sudden supply shock across interconnected economies simultaneously. The 1973 crisis took 18 months to fully destabilize the financial system. This one accomplishes the same destruction before the ash from the first strikes has finished falling. The generational weight of what this first morning represents is almost too large to hold in the mind at once. Every war in modern history has left financial scars that outlasted the physical ones by decades. Germany's reparations debt from World War I fixed at 132 billion gold marks in 1921, was not fully paid off until October 3, 2010, 92 years after the armistice. 3 generations of German families paid interest on a war their grandparents lost. Britain's loans from the United States to finance World War II were not finally settled until December 29, 2006, 61 years of payments. The check was written in the 21st century for a war fought in the 20th. The physical rebuilding takes years. The financial rebuilding takes lifetimes. A conflict of W3's projected economic magnitude would generate sovereign debt obligations that current actuarial models estimate could not be retired within the lifespans of anyone alive on the first morning it began. The compound interest alone on the emergency borrowing required to fund military operations, reconstruction, refugee crises, and infrastructure replacement would represent the largest transfer of wealth from future generations to present ones in recorded history. Your grandchildren will be paying this bill, and their grandchildren. The ledger does not forgive. It only adds. The IMF's post-conflict economic modeling for scenarios of this scale, published in a 2022 working paper that received almost no public attention, projected that affected economies would require between 40 and 70 years to return to pre-conflict GDP levels. Not growth beyond those levels, simply back to them. 4 to 7 decades just to return to where we stood the morning before it began. Let that number sink in. The lesson of the ledger is always the same. It has been the same lesson since the Roman Republic debased its silver currency to fund its legions in the 3rd century. It was the same lesson when Philip II of Spain, master of the greatest empire on earth and recipient of entire mountains of New World silver, declared bankruptcy 4 separate times between 1557 and 1596. It was the same lesson when the Weimar Republic printed money with such abandon that workers needed wheelbarrows of currency to buy a loaf of bread in 1923, and it is the same lesson written in the ash-gray sky of the first morning after WW3 begins. You cannot spend money you do not have forever. At some point, the bond market calls. At some point, the creditor arrives. At some point, the compounding arithmetic overcomes every political promise, every central bank maneuver, every accounting fiction constructed to delay the reckoning. When the reckoning arrives, it does not announce itself with a polite letter. It announces itself with the smell of burning infrastructure and the silence where the financial system used to be. The first morning after WW3 is not primarily the story of missiles and rubble. It is the story of a civilization that mortgaged its future so aggressively for so long that the future finally arrived and found nothing left to inherit. The bombs did not create the